Welcome to the last lecture on interest groups. And this is probably, hopefully, going to be a shorter lecture. Basically, this is a bunch of information that I want you to know as a citizen, but I'm probably not going to be testing you on it because, frankly, a lot of it is super complicated and it changes all the time. But what I want to do is spend this sort of last section talking about interest groups, talking about money and politics. And why is that? Because largely when we're talking about money and politics, we are in some way talking about an interest group or a lobbying organization or some other kind of interest representation, particularly the representation of special interest. Remember how we talked about that in the last two lectures about the difference between sort of thinking about interest groups as organizations versus thinking about them as or thinking about the representation of interests in our system. So we're going to talk about money and politics. So money and politics has this sort of history in our system, particularly when we're talking about campaign money. But the first thing that you need to remember is that interest groups are involved in campaigns. And they can be involved in terms of providing volunteers. And we see that with some grassroots groups who are able to encourage their members or their constituents to be active in campaigns by volunteering, by stuffing envelopes, by doing canvassing, by knocking on doors, doing those sorts of things. But frequently what ends up happening is that interest groups as a whole are more involved in campaigns, not necessarily by giving money specifically, but by channeling money to campaigns. So using their membership lists, using their contacts to say, hey, you ought to give money to this candidate. So how does that work? Well, the first way to think about this is the most direct, and these are political action committees. Now, just as an aside, the history of campaign finance in the United States is kind of complicated. So there wasn't a whole lot of rules. There were rules that sort of came into play as part of government reform, which we'll talk more about when we talk about the executive branch, particularly during the New Deal era and during the progressive era, even earlier than that, right around the turn of the 20th century. But the bottom line was this. There was then and still is now a complete ban on businesses, on corporations giving money directly to candidate campaigns. So that's true. It was true starting and during those reform periods, and it's true now. But over time, we have instituted more and more rules about the way people are allowed to spend money in campaigns. So you can think of money in some senses as a First Amendment issue. And in fact, that's how the Supreme Court has looked at it over time, to basically say that money is like speech. And so you cannot, there are only a couple places where you can limit money donations in the same way we limit free speech in certain cases in order to gain some other social good, right? So we can limit money donations in politics in the sense that you don't want to have any single person or organization having too much impact on campaigns directly. So that's where these political action committees come in. And they're basically an outgrowth of the more comprehensive campaign reform bill that went through in 1974. And it came in as a result of Watergate. So Watergate was a lot of things. It was a break-in, it was a cover-up, but it was also a function of campaign financing. Like, one of the reasons Nixon was doing the things that he was doing is because he was trying to get more campaign money. So there was a campaign finance law that went through in 1974, and it set up the Federal Elections Commission that governs the elections of all national offices, so the House, the Senate, and the President. And by virtue of how it did that, it creates this thing called political action committees. And this is important to know what these are. Political action committees are about campaign money. And that's important because we're going to talk about super PACs later, and they are not about campaign money. But political action committees are designed to give money directly to campaigns. And so they're meant to be aggregators. So they're what's called a 5,000 in, 5,000 out. People can donate up to $5,000 per election cycle to a particular political action committee. And political action committees can donate up to $5,000 per cycle to each candidate. Now, at the end of the day, that doesn't seem like very much, right? So why do these political action committees have power when all they can do is contribute $5,000? Well, they have some greater impact because the personal limit is $2,000. So I, as a voter, can donate up to $2,000 per cycle to a candidate. PACs can do $5,000. Still, that's not that much. So where do PACs have their power? It comes from something called bundling. So what do PACs do? Well, they've got all these wealthy people who give them money, right? And they give that to campaigns. But the other thing they can do is that they can have an event and have 100 of these wealthy people show up. And they can say to them, hey, we think you ought to spend your individual spending limit money on this candidate or this candidate. And so what happens? Well, think about it. If you've got 100 people in a room and they can each write a $2,000 check, that means that you have basically directed $200,000 of campaign funding directly to a campaign. That's why they have power. So because what's happening is that they are using their knowledge, right? Remember this whole conversation about information? PACs take that information that's important and allows them to connect wealthy donors in, say, California with people who are running for Congress in Georgia or in Illinois or in New Hampshire, who that person in California wouldn't have known about. But they know about the PAC, and they know the PAC. They know they support the PAC's ideas. And so really that's about hedging your bet. And political action committees can run the gamut in terms of who runs them and what their purpose is. So there are just sort of political action committees that are designed to get certain kinds of people elected. So there are PACs that are ideological PACs that are geared toward conservatives or geared toward progressives or liberals. Then this is things like Emily's List. Like Early Money is Like Yeast. It concentrates on women Democrats. That's who they raise money for. Okay, so that's just sort of a standard political action committee. The thing is that lots and lots of interest groups also have political action committees. Now, this gets it complicated because this is about tax law, but interest groups can largely operate as tax-exempt educational organizations. And so the Political Action Committee, which may be tied to them, but is not the same organization because PACs have a different tax designation. So, for example, there's the National Rifle Association, which is a nonprofit educational organization. And then there's also the NRA Legislative Committee, the NRALC. And that legislative committee is a PAC. And so what they're doing is they're sort of combining the roles, but there's a strict tax difference about what kind of money gets donated. So if you donate money to the NRA, you're donating to a tax-exempt nonprofit. If you donate to the NRA Legislative Committee, you're donating to a PAC. And so that's a political contribution. It's not tax deductible. Then there are also these political action committees that are created by members of Congress, particularly the leadership. And what they're using them for, the same kind of idea, but they're trying to more directly influence who gets nominated and who gets elected to office. So that's what PACs are. The important bottom line for you to remember is PACs are about campaign money. That's what they're about. And that matters because we're going to now start talking about a whole bunch of organizations that are not directly dealing with campaign money. Now, the big change that happens here, or the big structural change, is something that was called the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act. And actually, you're going to see a little bit about that in the end of the Casino Jack movie, or the last part of the Casino Jack movie that I have you watching. This was passed in 2003, and it was also called the McCain-Feingold bill. So basically, what BICRA does is it doesn't alter this sort of PAC structure. It actually increased the individual limits because they were at 1,000 per per person per cycle before 2003. Now they're at $2,000. It also took away, important thing to know is it took away what was called the soft money rule, which meant that you could give almost unlimited amounts of money to the parties. So to the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee for party building, right? So that ended up being get out the vote, canvassing, those sorts of things. It took away that, it limited that money, and it put into place a set of advertising rules. So it had a series of time limits on independent expenditure advertising, but those were struck down by the Supreme Court. The important thing to remember here is that BICRA is the reason that candidates have to say, for national office, have to say at the end of their advertisement, I am so-and-so and I approve this message. That means that that ad came directly from the campaign. Now, you'll see other ones that say this campaign ad paid for by American Crossroads or, other kinds of independent expenditure groups, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But the bottom line here is that BICRA made it harder for there to be unlimited money, at least within the systems that currently exist, so the parties, the campaigns, PACs, and it tried to make advertising more transparent so that you know who an ad is coming from. So I've said this term independent expenditure in the past, and what does this mean? Well, so within the cracks in the middle of the campaign finance laws, there is this category of organization, this category of behavior called independent expenditure. And at some level, this has existed for a while. The idea is that because campaign money is largely counted as speech, it means that individuals, even sort of your average Joe on the street, can pay for a political ad to support one candidate or another if they want to. That's called independent expenditure, and it's totally legal. But the thing is that there is a set of Supreme Court cases that has changed how we think about independent expenditure groups and has really increased the power of them. So independent expenditure groups basically have unlimited donations. Now, in many cases, it depends on the kind of tax organization that you're working with, because that's all what this is about. In most cases, those donations have to be disclosed. So you can get as much money as you want, but you have to report that, right? Because that's part of the campaign finance structure, is that candidates are required to disclose who all is donating to them and in what amounts. But most independent expenditure organizations are also required to disclose that. There's just no limit on that. Now, what happens in 2010 is there's the Supreme Court decision called Citizens United v. FEC. And the decision here was to say that the bottom line was that businesses can, and labor unions can, donate to independent expenditure groups. They still cannot donate directly to campaigns, to the candidates, but the businesses can donate to independent expenditure groups. And so that's what ends up happening. So these other groups, parties can donate money to these groups as well. The only rule is that these organizations cannot be in any way related to or have contact with the actual campaign organizations. Now, this is sort of a pretty fiction, right? Because no, they may not talk to one another, but an independent expenditure group who's trying to get a particular person elected president can listen to that person's speeches and hear what issues they are emphasizing and copy that, right? That's totally legal. The other thing that independent expenditure groups do, though, is they do issue advertising. So honestly, most of the more negative ads come from independent expenditure groups. So the ones that are saying things like, so-and-so lied on their tax return, right? And that's why they shouldn't be president, right? That's issue advertising. Then there's also this other tax designation called 527, on which a lot of this independent expenditures are based. Now, 527s became a big deal in the 2004 election, but they kind of fell out of favor because all of a sudden we had these independent expenditure groups, and we call them super PACs. Now, it's a terrible name because it's very confusing. PACs, right, we talked about, political action committees, are campaign money. They're about getting money directly to a candidate. Super PACs, however, are independent expenditure groups, and they're based on Citizens United, as I talked about before. There's a lot more that we could dig into here about how the tax code deals with nonprofits and political organizations, and the routes that are possible to hide money or to hide the source of money as they go into super PACs, but that's way complicated, and I'm not going to do that here. I spend a lot of time talking about that, though, in my interest groups and lobbying class when I teach it. But the important thing for you guys to recognize is that there's just a lot of money that's flowing around that is not controlled by the candidates themselves. It's controlled by other people, mostly who have the candidate's best interest at heart, but they don't have to, right? That's not the point. They may want to get a particular candidate elected, but they can use a lot of means that maybe the candidates themselves wouldn't do. So be aware of that. Pay attention to who is sponsoring the campaign ads that you are reading. Now, I have one more little section to talk to you about, but one of the things that I want to say is this. Independent expenditure is super complicated. I am not going to ask you any test questions about that. I do want you to know that PACs are campaign money and super PACs are independent expenditure, but that's about it. Because frankly, it is so complicated that, if you want to go to law school, specializing in campaign finance law, you will always have a job. Because it's very complicated. And here's the other secret. All 50 states have their own campaign finance regimes, right? That are not linked to the federal system for state level offices, for governor, for secretary of state, for members of the state legislature. And so it is super complicated to understand what rules apply at any given time. So that would be a useful path to go down if you want to be a lawyer. So why do we care about this, right? So I've now just told you about all this money, and it can come from businesses and it can come from wealthy individuals. And here's the thing. The reason that we care about money in politics is because, like some other things we've talked about, money can be a huge representation multiplier. Now, there's no direct evidence, and political scientists have been studying this for a long time. There's no direct evidence that giving a lot of money to a decision maker's campaign will make them change their mind about something. But think about that. That makes sense, right? Because you're likely to give money to candidates who you already agree with, and the same is true for businesses and other organizations. What we can demonstrate through political science research is that money gives you more access, right? So if you have donated a bunch of money to a campaign, you're much more likely to have access to that decision maker. I mean, that's what like half of the ambassadorships are in the whole, from the United States to other parts of the world. Yes, in some countries, you need somebody with a lot of experience, like if you're sending the ambassador to Russia. Yes, but what if you're sending the ambassador to the Maldives Islands, right? Like that is a political like plum. That's a gift, right? So if you have given a ton of money to the campaign or to the party, that's what you get. You get an ambassadorship somewhere. That kind of stuff happens all the time. So we know that money buys access. And so interest groups, corporations, lobbyists, people who are spending money in campaigns create a representational inequality. That's just the bottom line. It's a function of the system. Now, I mean, in some ways that makes sense, right? Like people who have more time and who are more articulate in certain ways and writing letters or calling their member of Congress have always had more impact. So people with more education have more impact because they have that ability to talk to their decision makers. But the thing is that money is such a huge impact. It creates so much more representation that it basically crowds out the voices of other people, right? So it's not so much that it makes it that they use their money to stop other voices, although that certainly happens. But it's almost the idea that it's just crowding out the other voices because money creates so much more representation. So it creates these resource inequalities, right? People with money, organizations, businesses just have much more money to give to campaigns and to independent expenditure groups. It creates an enormous amount of access inequality, right? The other thing too is that, and this is something that's a challenge for us to talk about because, right, so it highlights the idea of the privileged position of businesses in our political system. And we talked about that a little bit before when we talked about capitalism at the beginning of the semester. But the business of America is business, and it doesn't matter what party you're from, it only helps you to listen to what businesses need. In some cases, that makes sense, right? Businesses don't have any other explicit way of impacting policy, right? Like they don't have a vote. We didn't set up a system like that. Other countries had set up systems where business in general or certain kinds of corporations have a voice in government. We don't have that. But it does make sense that businesses need things, and businesses are the ones who are, whether we're talking about small business or large business, right? Most people, that's how they have a job, is because those businesses exist. But the reality is that the weight of particularly large corporations and the amount of money they have to spend just alters the impact of what their voices are in relationship to individual voters or other less resource groups in the system. And so that's why we have to pay attention to this, right? I'm not saying that business interest representation is all bad, but the reality is that it is unequal. And so we have to pay attention to that and understand how do we then as voters and as citizens try to create more equality in the ways we communicate to decision makers what our needs are. So that's why we care about money in politics, and we talk about it in the context of interest groups and lobbying, because it's all part of this system of representing your interest to government or representing the interests of groups or organizations or people with certain identities, right, to government. And so that's why this is all mixed up together. So that's the end of the lectures for the interest group and lobbying section. We will begin again after the exam talking about Congress.